Hi everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of the Behold podcast on the Genre Equality channel. I'm Hitzer.
I'm Isa.
This week we're going to be talking about one of the most influential, groundbreaking science fiction franchises of all time. Of course, we're talking about Frank Herbert's iconic books, an iconic first book too,
Yeah.
Dune. The Dune series, we'll be talking about it in all its incarnations, including, of course, the official canon work of Frank Herbert, his iconic novels that kickstarted the franchise, and then we'll be talking about perhaps the strengths and weaknesses of the semi-canonical continuations
hmm
by his son Brian Herbert. Subsequent to that, we'll take a look back at the various adaptations that have come through, trying to bring the immense and complex world of Dune onto the big and small screens, including David Lynch's uh, failed or flawed attempt in
Yeah.
1984.
Yeah.
Jodorowsky's ambitious, shall we say, abomination. Um, that never came to pass, but would have been intriguing regardless.
Yeah.
And on the flip side of that, we also have a very cheap, very unambitious, but yet super faithful sci-fi miniseries starring James McAvoy that happened back in the mid noughts. So we'll be talking about all of that first, but like we'll begin with Dune, of course, the classic Frank Herbert novel that kickstarted it off, and then we'll move on to its various sequels. But before we begin talking about Dune, you've been a Dune fan, I think, longer than I have. What has it meant to you? How did it capture your imagination? And all that sorts of stuff, because I assume like this is a bit of a, as anyone who read Dune in their early life, it's kind of a landmark moment in your sci-fi fandom. Am I right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
I think like Dune um I stumbled upon Dune when I think I was like 13, 14, right? And then it was about the time that I kind of fell in love. Like I had just prior to that read Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
And I was kind of like searching for that epicness of it, but perhaps in a slightly different genre because like I had done Lord of the Rings, I had done the I can't remember the author's name, but basically it was like a series of fictional histories regarding Alexander as well. So
Mm.
I was looking for just a world to kind of dive into, and Dune just kind of came up on a very simple search at the library. And yeah, I remember picking out from thing. I remember looking at the artwork. It's a very very iconic picture of just like the sandworm, Shai Hulud coming out of the sand right in front. I think it's one of the first few
Mm.
fully illustrated covers that they had for
The
Dune.
the old paperbacks from the 19s. I don't know when. I met my paperback, which my mother owned prior to mine, is very old and weathered. It's like the pages are super yellow, so it's from way back.
Yeah, yeah, they're like super super uh, iconic for me. I think like I wasn't entirely sold maybe on the premise necessarily, just because at that point in time wasn't really that big into sci-fi, very honestly.
Mm.
um but reading Dune in its entirety a number of times before this year, and especially I think that first read through of the original first book was
Mm.
very important for my formative years. I think there were a lot of ideas there about like personage and the hero's journey that as a young man trying to find his way in the world, I latched onto a great deal. What the skills would be necessary, to kind of like navigate the world around me that was getting increasingly complicated and things like that. Ideas like the Bene Gesserit kind of prana bindu mastery of the body,
Mm.
the command of the voice, the possibility that humans could be supercomputers.
Mm.
These were all kind of things that later on, well, as I started to grow, that influenced me very deeply to kind of do research into like real life versions of that and what would the possibilities were.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just because like I saw something in what Paul became that I found incredibly attractive. But retrospectively, of course, right? As I grew older, as I gained a better understanding of everything past the first book,
Mm,
there's plenty that Herbert was trying to say past that initial kind of like growth of the hero's journey,
mm,
particularly in Messiah, particularly in God Emperor,
mm,
about the greater cost, to society at large, and to the persons involved in the story, about heroes, right? About these people in which, like, so many of the political, the social, the economic, the religious aspects and spiritual aspects of life um intersect with,
yeah.
and how problematic that could be, as an example, in this vast universe that he created.
Mm-hmm.
um so yeah, I mean, like, Dune, really important. I'm guessing that with this year's read through in preparation for this episode, and also, just brushing up for the movie
Mm,
that came out, probably four times, I think, in its entirety.
yeah.
So yeah, big fan. It's always hard, I think, like, I was telling you before the movie, it's always hard going into a movie whose story has lived in your head for so many years.
Yes.
There's so many things that could be possibly different, and then you have this kind of internal conflict, whether or
Mm-hmm.
not it matches up. But
Mm.
that, of course, and the review of that movie will be coming up at our next episode of Genre Equality.
Oh
And
yeah.
yeah, and we're
Very
gonna
soon.
focus on everything that has come before and how important it's been.
Of course, without Dune, which is known as one of the most, if not the most influential sci-fi novels of all time,
Hmm.
I suppose some people would call it the greatest. I probably wouldn't go that far, but to call it not influential is missing the mark, right? It's
Oh yeah,
clearly very influential. There is no Star Wars without Dune. There's no Game of Thrones without Dune.
yeah.
There's no Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind without Dune. These are some of the major landmarks that have been inspired by Frank Herbert. And
Hmm.
of course, Frank Herbert himself didn't create Dune in a vacuum. It was inspired by many things that came before, including his real work in the study of desert cultures and deserts and desert ecology. In his work as an ecologist,
Yeah.
as well as in his readings of Isaac Asimov's Foundation novels. If you want to read more about how I kind of dissect how Frank Herbert created Dune as a counterpoint to Isaac Asimov's Foundation books, you can read it in my article in Popwire, so I won't go too in depth into it. What I
Hmm.
will say about my introduction to Dune is that I should have watched or read other things first before I came upon Dune, because I came upon Dune,
Oh,
in secondary school.
yeah.
It was like you. I was attracted to fantasy at first, which is weird because fantasy is like my least favorite genre at the moment. Like as I've
Yeah.
drifted away and I've discovered more things, but fantasy was my beginning point into literature.
Hmm.
Obviously starting with fairy tales, and then I raided my mom's library because she used to be a lit major in NUS and all of that.
Hmm.
And she had all these amazing books on her shelf, and the first things I gravitated to were kind of the more young adult stuff, and then I
Yeah.
moved on to more fantasy based stuff. I think like the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice was one of the few things there,
Oh
and
yeah.
then I moved
Hmm.
on to sci-fi.
Hmm.
And why I think, like, for you and for me and for lots of people, Dune is a very easy gateway into sci-fi is because it is almost not sci-fi. It is one of the softest science fiction novels you'll ever find,
Yeah.
and it's thus easy to, or perhaps the boundary between fantasy and sci-fi in Dune is very slim.
Yeah. Hmm.
In the way that like N.K. Jemisin's work is you can't tell whether it's sci-fi or whether it's fantasy because elements of both are present in it. But Dune to me was a deconstruction of the hero's journey, of the Messiah story,
Hmm.
of the savior story, of the chosen one archetype. They would have been a lot more impactful to me like early on if I was familiar with the archetype, because I hadn't
Yeah.
seen Star Wars. I
Hmm.
hadn't, I wasn't familiar with all the Judeo-Christian messaging, or parallels in the book, and stuff like that. So I like this book made me very cynical of the hero's journey. So like when I was watching Star Wars, I was always like, is Luke Skywalker a good guy? I'm not sure. I mean, because of that, lah. But
Yeah.
And then as I grew older, I came to appreciate, as I reread Dune more and more, I came to appreciate more of its political elements. So some have called it, like the political intrigue in A Song of Ice and Fire, for example, is
Hmm.
heavily inspired by the house warfare and the strategic battles going on in the Dune books.
Yeah.
And there's so much going on there, as well as I learned more about environmentalism,
Hmm.
about ecology, about religion specifically, because I grew up in uh later on, like in life, like I was kind of forced to attend a madrasa. I'm not gonna get into that, but I was very familiar with like Islamic custom and all that, lah.
Yeah.
And the Fremen in Dune always struck me at first as Islam inspired. What I came to realize later on was that it is literally Islam that has just been
Yeah.
changed and warped over time through ecology, through different environments of different planets, through different political systems, and most importantly, through the religious engineering of the Bene Gesserit, who have implanted and changed the religion to their own whims to achieve their own purposes.
Hmm.
And the idea of religious engineering alongside their eugenics program was very fascinating to me on a conceptual level.
Yeah.
I will say though that like Dune, I had a lot of problems with it in the beginning,
Yeah.
because I was always a very this hasn't changed to now. Like, in fact, if you listen to any of the episodes of Behold or Genre, like I'm a very character person.
Yeah.
Like I like character journeys and character growth. And Dune was my first introduction into huge world building where it felt like homework reading. I had to learn new terms,
Hmm.
I had to learn new names, I had to learn new rules to the world. And the world felt like a character, the universe felt like a character, but the characters themselves not feel like characters, at least up to the point of God Emperor.
Yeah.
The second half of Dune was very character driven, but the first half was not. It was very plot driven, and the ideas were so large that like I don't think there was space in Herbert's mind to like fully flesh out his characters as more than plot devices. As I come to grow older, I came to appreciate that more, the imagination that goes into the world building. That was incredible to me. It was just my first experience in that kind of world. I had not read like you. I had not. I mean, you had read Tolkien before that, right? I had not.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
this was my first introduction into that. Before we talk about the Dune novel, right? Like, let me give you a basic breakdown of what the premise is.
Yeah.
Um,
Good luck, man.
if if you are not familiar with Dune and want to keep spoiler free for the new movie, or if you plan to read the book soon, you probably shouldn't be listening to this episode, as just a fair warning.
Yeah.
But I don't think it will. I really don't think that it's going to affect your appreciation, even if you're exposed to spoilers.
Mm.
But I'm just gonna lay out the bare bones for you at the moment here, lah. So Dune is set in the far future, millennia from now, where warring noble houses are kind of kept in line by a ruthless galactic emperor. So as part of this Byzantine political intrigue, the noble Duke Leto, head of the House Atreides, is forced to move his household from their paradise home planet of Caladan to the desert planet of Arrakis, colloquially known as Dune. The climate of Dune is frighteningly hostile.
Hmm.
Water is so scarce that whenever its inhabitants go outside, they must wear still suits, these close fitting garments that capture body moisture and recycle it for drinking. Your sweat, your tears, your pee, whatever you discard is recycled through the still suit. The great enemy of House Atreides is the House Harkonnen, who are a bunch of no good brutes who torture people for fun, whose head Baron Vladimir is so obese that he has to use these anti-gravity suspensors as he moves around.
Hmm.
The Harkonnens used to control Dune, which, despite its awful climate and grubby desert nomad people, has incalculable strategic significance. Its southern desert is the only place in the galaxy where a fantastically valuable commodity called melange or spice is mined. Spice is a drug whose many useful properties include the induction of a kind of enhanced space-time perception in pilots
Yep.
of interstellar aircraft. Without it, the entire communication and transport system of the Imperium will collapse. It's invaluable for navigation. It is also highly addictive, and it has the side effect of turning the eye of the user a deep blue. Spice mining is dangerous, not just because of sandstorms and nomad attacks, but because the noise it generates attracts gigantic sandworms. Behemoths many hundreds of meters in length that travel through the dunes. It's like whales in the ocean.
Hmm.
And the Harkonnens are forced to give up Dune, but have they really given up Dune? The source of fabulous riches? Of course not. Treachery and tragedy ensue. And the son of Duke Leto, a young Paul Atreides, survives a general bloodbath to go on the run in the hostile open desert, accompanied, unusually for an adventure story, by his mom, who is also a Bene Gesserit. Paul is already showing signs of the kind of cosmic precociousness. By he has abilities in many things. I'm not going to break it down for you.
Yeah.
He's almost OP, but he's very precocious in a lot of things. And
Yeah.
people suspect that he may even be the Messiah figure foretold in ancient prophecies, according to the religions and the beliefs of the Dune people, of the Freemen.
Hmm.
His mother Jessica is an initiate of this great female power base in an otherwise patriarchal galactic order. It's a religious sisterhood, as I mentioned, called the Bene Gesserit. They are kind of witchy and psychically powerful. And
Hmm.
the sisters have engaged in a millennia of eugenic programming and religious engineering, of which Paul may be the culmination. um what a great setup for these stories, that it's sort of been, if you have read the foundation novels, you can already see the parallels happening here, but the
Yep.
directions that Frank Herbert leads are vastly different, and the conclusions that he draws are very different. um what are the aspects of the initial Dune novel that you think is revolutionary and holds water today?
Revolutionary. Okay, I mean, like things that definitely still hold water today. No pun intended.
Yeah.
Is the ecological themes, right? Like
Yes.
if
Yeah.
there is no, there might have been no time in the history of mankind in which Dune's ecological tenets speak to our time. What I mean, like with huge desertification going on in our world right now, and with global warming, all the various kind of like weather major changes in the weather patterns and ecological disasters going on,
Mm-hmm.
just trying to trying to see Dune and man's relationship with their environment, right? In this particular case, the planet of Dune itself is has been I think that has been the most poignant part of rereading the entire series this year. This entire idea that we um the way in which humankind has exploited the land for its benefit, and this huge capitalistic fervor and expansion, not into the stars necessarily, in our
Mm-hmm.
case, but just in general. I think that hits home, and very, very close to home, much harder than any other time that I've read Dune itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. That's one. The other one would definitely be, again, ideas of religion, um, ideas of xenophobia,
Mm.
that all kind of like play out from this incredible universe that Frank Herbert has built out. And these themes, I mean, over the ages, I'm sure they've been recurring, but some of them are really like, they really do hit very close to home, and are kind of painful, to be honest, because like we are on track to seeing some of these things happen, or already have seen some of these things happen in our own reality. um
Yes.
and there, it feels like there's nothing much we can do about it, right? We don't have, a Paul or a Leto, one of these great overpowered characters to come in and intervene into any of that.
And do we really want to, seeing as how Paul and Paul the second, or and Leto the second turned out? Yeah,
Exactly, yeah.
yeah.
So it's this huge confluence of things that I think it's the main draw of people who enjoy the kind of literature. Like it's not just, a single layered thing. Every reading that you're gonna reread of any one of the books is gonna continue to produce more, and as you grow as a person and your awareness of, the social, ecological, economic issues
Mhm.
around you in your life begin to grow, so does your understanding of what Frank Herbert was trying to do.
Mm.
And that, I think that that's going to be a big draw, especially with the new movie coming out, and I'm guessing there's going to be like a ton of fans who are either reading Dune before going into the cinema or reading Dune after going into the cinema, and they're going to
Yep.
discover like a lot of very powerful, very poignant things to think about in our time.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You mentioning the exploitation of natural resources from poverty-stricken areas.
Yeah.
We're seeing more and more of that today, lah. But even back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think if you asked people from the Middle East, specifically with regards to oil, or people from Africa who has a millennia of this happening to them,
Yeah.
it probably has been happening to them for a very long time, lah. And this is just like,
Mhm.
yep, yep, yep. This will happen now. It has happened. It will happen in the future. Um the theme of environmentalism and ecology is obviously, I think, the most important or prevalent aspect of Dune
Yeah.
that the modern reader would get. I think Dune has been called like the first planetary ecology novel on a huge scale, on a grand scale.
Mhm.
And it treats the subject of ecological change and its consequences with a thought that a lot of fantasy and science fiction do not, especially at that time.
Yeah.
With its, especially in 1965, with its complex descriptions of, the life on Arrakis, the ecosystem, the giant sandworms,
Mhm.
for whom the water is deadly. There's the smaller mouse like life forms adapted to life with limited water. Of course, Muad'Dib is named after him.
Mhm.
Um, Du- Dune has this, complex and unique ecologies that a lot of science fiction books take inspiration from in the future,
Yeah.
but did not have at that present time. One of the most interesting things about Dune, though, I think, this frequently goes unmentioned, despite it being a huge part of it, is that, as I said, Dune is a landmark of science fiction.
Mhm.
That soft science fiction. There is no real sci-fi in Dune.
There's no real hard science. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Herbert deliberately suppressed technology in the Dune universe so he could address the politics of humanity,
Uh huh.
rather than the future of humanity's technology. I think Dune is more interested in considering the ways humans and their institutions might change over time.
Mhm.
And he does it with the intriguing backstory of the Butlerian Jihad, where humanity rebelled against technology a long, long time ago. There is very little known about it, but
Yeah.
it plays a major part in how every character in Dune thinks, and why there is such a resistance to upgrading technology in the world. Like it's a story that takes place over 5,000 years, and technology barely evolves. It's because of the Butlerian Jihad. It's not a flaw in the plot. It's intentional.
Mhm.
And that allows Dune to be this epic of political betrayal, ecological brinksmanship, and messianic deliverance that it could not have been otherwise in Isaac Asimov's work or in Arthur C. Clarke's work. It's a very different kind of thing that he wants to explore, and that's very interesting. What intrigued me the most, though, even at a young age, right? I
Mhm.
was very into history, super into like the Roman Empire and like the great, like, historical battles and shit like that. Like, who isn't, right? When you were a kid, like. And one thing that I noticed very, very early on, and has been made clear to me ever since I read the book, and Frank Herbert has outright said that, like, I have based this book entirely. It's almost a fictional adaptation of Edward Gibbons's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is
Mm.
a non-fiction book that came out.
Yeah.
Which argues that Christianity, uh, with the Roman elite, led to the fall of ancient Rome. So the parallels of ancient history together with the Imperium in Dune is very clear cut. Like there is no there is no like room for like argument about this. This is clearly based on ancient Rome.
Yeah.
Um, the foundation books were also based on Edward Gibbons's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the very same book. Whether this was intentional or not, I don't know. No, neither has said. But it's clear that Asimov found inspiration in that book first. And and Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that particular nonfiction book, has inspired a lot of other sci-fi since
Mhm.
then. So perhaps they were independent inspirations. I don't know, but I found it very very cool. The story of heroism, this kind of modern day conglomeration of familiar myths,
Yeah.
um, uh, uh, you know, of a messiah, of a precious commodity. It resembles a lot of myth in Judeo-Christian religions, in a lot of sci-fi, in a lot of works, in nearly everything, in Greek mythology, in Greek literature, in everything that humanity has ever crafted, right? There's always this hero myth,
Mhm.
the rise to a Superman status, our savior, the hero's journey template, what Dune does best, as I mentioned, and what is most radical, perhaps not in Dune, but in Dune's sequels, were the deconstruction of the hero's journey. You should have gotten that idea that Paul is not necessarily a good guy
Yeah.
because he accepts his mentor of savior a little bit too easily. He's very eager. He's very eager. He has this thirst for vengeance. He has this prescience that already tells him that his jihad is bound for centuries of bloody battle that will claim billions of lives, and
Mhm.
he does it anyway.
Yeah.
He regrets it later on, lah, but still, like, he's not a good person, lah, and it's an interesting take on the hero's journey. It teaches you to never believe in a savior, and as it turns out, like, that Two Face quote. What was it from The Dark Knight? You live long enough to see yourself become the villain, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that's kind of like the Dune books in a nutshell. Of course, like, growing up in Islam, and being a Muslim and all of that, the similarities to Middle Eastern culture,
Uh-huh.
Sufism, and Islam was very intriguing to me. There's a lot of, like, Arabic language and wordage, right,
Yep.
and undertones and in the themes in the book. It's very very cool to me. The whole idea of, the desert dwelling people, their military capacity, brought to mind a lot of the desert warfare, specifically in Afghanistan, which is, has been has been that way for a long time lah.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, including this year. It's, oh boy. Let's not get into that lah. It introduced me to Zen. Uh,
Mm.
z- um, I don't know what to call it. Is it a systems of belief? Is it religion or philosophy?
It
But introduced me to Zen
yeah.
philosophy
Yeah.
also.
Philosophy. Mhm.
Yeah, that was very very interesting to me, how they posited, religions would move on in the future, with the Orange Catholic Bible, with the Fremen religion. All was fascinating, and that is what makes Dune such a landmark work and such an imaginative piece of world building. Is there
Mhm.
like anything that we haven't mentioned or I have missed out that you like to you talk about?
I think we've touched all of it. Ecology, declining empires, all the influences, Middle
Mhm.
Eastern and so on,
Yeah, yeah,
heroism,
yeah,
gender
yeah.
dynamics. Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much
Yo,
like the main kind of like the main thrust of themes that span all six original books. Yeah, pretty much.
oh, absolutely. Dune as a book is an almost perfect novel, in terms of its impact, in terms of its influence, and in terms of what it wants to say. But like with every great sci-fi book, there are sequels, and Frank Herbert is no exception to this. He crafted
Hmm.
a couple of sequels that not a couple, a lot of sequels that were pretty good, and then continued with what's his name, Brian Herbert's continuations as well.
Yep.
Uh, uh, I do have to say though that as influential as Dune is, as great of a book it is not my favorite book in the Dune franchise.
Hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about. Okay, you pick out what is your favorite book in the Dune franchise, and tell me why, and how does it differ from Dune, or how does it improve upon Dune? Like, what is your favorite book in the five novels that Frank Herbert wrote?
I think for me, it's got to be Messiah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's got to be Messiah. We were having a couple of to and fro about this much earlier in the year, as we were just making our way through the books. I've come to a consensus with you that it has to be Messiah. I think it is because upon rereading it again,
Mm-hmm.
it is a great length, right? It
Yeah.
is the book of most importance and consequence to the messages that Frank Herbert wanted to say, right? Like
Mm.
you spend this entire like this epic, like God, what is it, like 800 pages, building up this entire world, this entire universe, and all the characters within it, right? And at the apex of this, you have Paul, and in Messiah, you slowly, succinctly break down every problem with what you have built, right? And all the
Yes.
consequent books from there, with maybe perhaps some of the later books do divert from that a bit, but like essentially, it is those recurring themes, right, over and over again, right?
Hmm.
Whether or not it's the talk about like the religion or having a godhead and seated within political power, those get revisited again in God Emperor in a slightly different tone. um
Yep.
and I think for me, because it is that important and because of it is of consequence to what comes before and what comes after, Messiah has to be it for me, for
Yes.
sure.
Yes.
And it's
Yeah.
perhaps I think it is the first time, well, it is the second book, but it's the first time we really get like deep kind of look into the characters that we've been introduced to. Paul's internal monologue kind of takes a forefront. Chani becomes a bit more of a thing.
Yes.
And like we get into their heads a bit more. We're starting to understand a bit more. There's a lot more dialogue here,
Hmm.
that allows us peeks into their inner life and their inner struggles that we don't necessarily get enough of in the original book.
Yeah.
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 So yeah, for me, I can't remember what it was I said before, but at this point in time, it's definitely Messiah.
Oh yes, my biggest issue with Messiah was that it wasn't so much a book as the final chapter of Dune.
Oh yeah.
It's like I felt it should have just been tacked on to Dune. To be honest, it didn't feel like a standalone work by itself.
Yeah.
But it was so important what it was trying to say,
Yeah.
and the conclusion of the Dune story, at least the initial Dune story, that I felt like it was like the missing final chapter of Dune.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
I completely get that.
And perhaps that's why it is so important, and yet at the same time so little regarded in terms of its strength as a whole, like
Yeah.
as an independent book.
Mm-hmm.
It is more like a final novella chapter that should have been an appendix to Dune rather than a separate
Yeah.
book away from Dune.
Yeah.
And I totally get that. My favorite book of Dune is in of like literally my top three favorite books of Dune were the last three books.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Beginning with God Emperor, which I think is the first time. Well, I actually no, like Children of Dune is before God Emperor. So
Yep.
Children of Dune, God Emperor, Heretics, and Chapter House. To me get exponentially better.
Yep.
And that's primarily because Frank Herbert started to focus a bit on character work here,
Yeah.
particularly God Emperor of Dune, which
Mm-hmm.
plays a bit like foundation fanfic in the long discussions that the God Emperor has with various people talking about this, talking about that.
Yeah.
It was Frank Herbert doing like an Aaron Sorkin script. Basically it's
Oh
just
yeah.
like long chapters of dialogue talking about economy, ecology, politics, like everything. Like, it was the least action oriented book of Dune.
Uh-huh.
And perhaps that's why it's the most hated book of Dune, but it's my personal favorite book of Dune because of that. Like it sets these thousands of years, like 3,500 years, right
Mm-hmm.
after
That's right.
the end of the initial Dune saga, and you get to see how the universe has changed
Mm-hmm.
politically, religiously, spiritually, technologically. What the impact of the God Emperor has done, and and the consequences of what Paul has done before him. You get to really see that, and it's rare for sci-fi to be like that wide spanning,
Uh-huh.
without losing track of the characters in the momentum. Because God Emperor of Dune begins a bit like a modern YA book. You follow this plucky young girl, right?
Yeah.
Who's fighting the evil emperor, the God Emperor of Dune. Leto the second, Paul's grandson,
Son.
son. Yes, yes, sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
Paul's son. And she's running through a forest. She's climbing over rivers. She's dying of freezing cold. She is, like getting scraped by rocks, and there are birds and there are wolves chasing her in this deep dark forest. And I was like, man, this is a cool opening scene. Like, but it felt more like Hunger Games. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
where is this? And then like the certain landmarks are shown, and then you're like, oh fuck, this is Dune after he has gone after he has gone through like this incredible ecological transformation. The dream of Liet Kynes is finally realized in this fourth book of Dune. You know, it's become this large garden paradise. You know, at the cost of the Freeman culture. You know,
Mhm.
is that good? Is that bad? The book explores that. You know, the book explores the resistance against the God Emperor of Dune, which is very interesting. And the girl at the center of Dune, immune to the God Emperor's prescience,
Yep.
was by design. Very cool as well. It had, I mean, one of the greatest openings of any of the Dune books. To be honest, like
Agreed.
Dune always takes like
A
a
while.
hundred
Yeah.
100 pages for you to get sucked in, right?
Yeah.
This one, bam, page one, you're in it. You're like, what the fuck is going on, right? So you just keep flipping, and then it gets more interesting from there. You get to know the characters on a deeper level. You get to know Leto the Second on a deeper level than even Paul. You know,
Yeah.
and then you
Mhm.
move on to Heretics and Chapter House Dune, which introduced well, okay, the Duncan Idaho has always been around, lah, but Duncan
Yeah.
Idaho has never been fleshed out in the way that he has been in Heretics and Chatterhouse Dune. If you're wondering why Duncan Idaho is alive 3,500 years from now,
Yeah.
let's just say that across all the books, varieties of his clones have popped up ad nauseum,
Uh-huh.
almost ad nauseum, lah. But like it gets a bit like tired after a while. But in God Emperor, it's like the Duncan Idaho clone.
Yeah.
Gola is what they call them in the
Yeah.
books, right?
Yep.
That you really get invested in.
Yeah.
Like he is the prime Duncan, shall we say?
Mhm.
And then you get introduction of Miles Tech, which is fucking cool. He is this like mentat military general,
Mhm.
who looks like he reminds me of Charles Dance, the guy who plays the Lannister father in Game of Thrones. He has like that vibe about him. And he's just so fucking cool. He's like, what if Batman was in Dune? And this was the first time. Okay, like to backtrack, right? One of my
Yep.
biggest issues with Dune, the book, was
Uh-huh.
that the issues of mentats, while very interesting, human beings who have been developed to become supercomputers who can think
Yep.
because computers aren't allowed in this universe.
Mhm.
They are so smart. They are so incredible. They're like 15 steps ahead. But like they are only as smart as the plot allows them to be sometimes,
Yeah.
and they're sometimes so remarkably stupid because the plot has I mean, they have to be stupid for the plot to continue.
Yeah.
So it feels like a very or an inelegant way and inconsistent way of presenting mentat powers. Sometimes they're smart, sometimes they're stupid, sometimes they're geniuses, and sometimes they can't see what's right in front of their nose. It's just very messy lah. Like I don't like to see powers displayed that way. And mentat should many times be smarter than what they should be like. And if I can see a plot in the book, right? If I can see the conspiracy, like why can't you?
Mhm.
I'm presented with the same information that you are. So why can't you this mentat figure it out? Mao Stag was the first mentat that I encountered,
Yeah.
and the first military general that I encountered that was truly a genius in both respects. And I fucking loved him. It was like he's my favorite character in Dune.
Mhm.
And if there's ever a Dune spin-off, I want it to be about Mao Stag.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, like
yeah.
that. I don't understand. Like Brian never ever took Miles Tech to kind of like flash upon,
Yeah, yeah,
which
yeah, yeah.
which is a bit of a waste. But I mean, that being said, right? If the movie takes off and enough money comes through with all of that, I mean,
Mhm.
I really hope someone out there is like, you know, who really needs their own show?
Yeah.
Miles Tech. Yeah.
Mao Stag, and the Benny Gesserit in the last three books also.
Oh yeah.
I've never seen them so competent. Yeah, I mean, you see in the first two books, first three books especially, the Benny Gesserit have created this plan for millennia, for thousands of years. They've crafted this plan.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I've never seen a group of people so incompetent to like pull the final trigger. Like they get messed up at every stage of the plan. You
Yeah.
know, and I'm like, have you really thought this through? And in the final three books, the last two Reverend Mothers in particular that we follow,
Mhm.
are very sympathetic, despite the fact that the last two books are literally. I'm not trying to turn you guys off here, but it's literally their plot is to rape a child. I'm not kidding. Like that's the plot of the last two books. They're like, let's kidnap this child and like let's rape him because we need his successor.
Yeah.
It's very like distasteful, but at the same time, like the political maneuverings have never been more competent. At least not from what I've seen in Dune, because
Yeah.
um, it's just very interesting to me. I thought the characters in the last few books are way more well fleshed out and well thought out, and they
Uh-huh.
seem more internally consistent.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, the imagination and world building of the last half of the series were not as imaginative as the first half of the series. So there are pros and cons to that, and I really think an author has just enough mind space to focus on one and not the other. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally understand. I kind of always thought that Heretics and Chapter House in particular was just with everything that he had done with original Dune and later on with God Emperor, right? With the world building, allowed Herbert to kind of move away from that
Yep.
in order to to explore some of the more deeper human implications, right, on very personal levels, surprisingly, instead of taking on this macro view all the time. But I do agree with you, like Chapter House as a planet isn't very exciting or
Mhm.
well thought out. Even the descriptions of the vast desertification that they're trying to do, and they're just like stripping the wool for the sake of their purpose, right, to bring back the sandworms, um,
Mhm.
doesn't quite have the same natural scale that you get from almost every book.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure if you want to step away from that, but then again, right, there was supposedly two unwritten books, or
Mhm.
unfinished books at the point of Frank Herbert's passing.
Yep.
So it's hard to say.
You know what Chapter House Dune or Chapter House the Planet
Yeah.
reminds me of the most? It reminds me of like how Benioff and Weiss portrayed the Dorne in Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
yeah,
like, oh,
yeah.
there's this huge planet, right? But then you spend an inordinate amount of time on like their compound,
Mm-hmm.
like describing like their furniture and like their villas and their gardens, and like this is a small part of this planet, but like this planet is represented by just like one house. I guess that's kind of the point to the story,
Yeah.
but it's still like very uninteresting and unimaginative, especially compared to the level of detail that we got in Arrakis, right? So it really reminded me of
Yeah.
Dawn, like weirdly enough, although it's not the sand planet, like Dawn is. It also like had an inordinate focus on these things. I know this is very sidetracked. It's such a small part of the book, right? But this thing really fucked me up. Like you're aware of chair dogs, right?
Yeah.
These dogs that literally become chairs for human
Mm,
beings
yeah.
and like mold themselves around you. Um, it's one of the most fucked up concepts I've ever heard in sci-fi. And don't you think?
I mean, like, okay, so for me, right, like the whole idea of having like this nanotechnology that forms to your body wherever you go,
No,
it,
but it's alive.
yeah,
It's a literal dog.
but like they are basically like the mentats, right? You needed something to replace,
Mhm.
supercomputers. So you got like organic things to replace the possible nanotechnology of
Mhm.
chairs that would just form around you. It is totally bizarre and totally fucked up, right? And like the
Yeah.
descriptions of them are just like, man, they are uncomfortable. To just imagine, if we ever get like, a movie or a TV series in that particular realm, I'm not sure how they're gonna pull it off without just freaking people out.
I mean, I suppose they can lah. Like people tend to close one eye with animal cruelty if they don't. I don't know. I mean, look at Pokemon.
Yeah, yeah.
People will close one eye lah, but it's just so fucked up, right? The very idea. It's crazy. It's like of all the things that happen in Dune, right? The billions of people dying, the wars, the bloodshed, this fucking god emperor that plays human society like a fiddle, and the suffering and the privation. It's chair dogs that got me. I was like,
Yeah,
oh.
yeah, because it is like the closest approximation of like casual human cruelty, right, on a mass scale that hits really, really close to home.
Hmm.
And it's that's yeah. I mean, I was disturbed. I'm not sure if I was as hung up about it as you when I was reading chapter I was doing.
Yep.
Yeah, but I mean, I totally understand. I totally understand. Like. one of the strangest things I think that has ever been introduced by Herbert.
Oh, definitely, you know. Yeah, the descendants of the Atreides, of which Mousestack is one of them, proliferate throughout the system. What's interesting about the later books of Dune, though, is that they have essentially the idea of what the God Emperor wants to do is, right. He wants to suppress and oppress them to the point where they will no longer accept the savior, and will go out into the stars and become as diverse and as populous and as chaotic as possible,
Yep.
because that's the only way the human race can thrive and survive
Yep.
in the future.
Yeah.
It can no
A
longer
very different
want
approach. Yeah.
to foundation. Exactly. Foundation had the exact opposite
Hmm.
argument, where order and
Yeah.
rationality was the way to survive. Like Frank Herbert argues that chaos and disorder and diversity is the way to survive. So like there's all these different people branching out into different corners of not just our galaxy, but further out, which is very interesting. And then they come back for an unknown reason, right? And a reason that we will never know now, because Frank Herbert is dead. You know, the last book ends on a cliffhanger. But you know, the factions that come back, the Bene Gesserit offshoot, the fish speakers offshoot, you know, and all of that are
Mm.
very, very interesting. The fish speakers, if you don't know, this kind of commando, all female Dora Milaje kind of
Yep. Yep. Yep.
team that
That.
that yeah, that the God Emperor
Um,
tasks to protect him.
mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought the fish speakers were a cool concept. Just like it was kind of a lame name. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Like with so many like fascinating like terms and titles and groups,
Yeah.
fish speakers definitely fell flat for me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's his world, so.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've kind of talked at length about the later books, you know, like post Dune Messiah. Like, what are your favorite parts of it, and what are your least favorite parts of it? Like, what works and what doesn't?
um okay, I found, I mean, I really like God Emperor, right? Oh, and just like for those of you who don't know, like Dune was written as a series of trilogies, more or less,
Mm-hmm,
right? With the first three books, all the way up to Children of Dune being one trilogy, and then from Heretics, Chapter House,
mm-hmm,
and what is coded as Dune 7,
mm-hmm.
as the a second trilogy.
Yep.
God Emperor occupies this very very unique space of being transitionary,
Mm-hmm,
and like filling the role for that. So everything that Hits has talked about all this like vast uh, knowledge dump, essentially, right? Through
mm-hmm.
through through everything and the story that's going on there. But God Emperor reads very much like a love story,
Yep.
for the first time, right? Like it's not a heroic epic like the first Dune. It is not a cautionary tale.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's kind of a cautionary tale, but like first and foremost, it's a love story, and
Yep.
like it is insane how within the matter of a few books you can invert something that you've created and then invert it again, right?
Mm.
Especially the whole idea of the scattering and the golden path that Leto is trying to engineer, right, over this like three and a half millennia,
Mm-hmm.
in absolute, not just in Herbert's idea, complete opposite of what's in Foundation, right, but like in absolute contrast to the idea of Paul's original jihad. um
Mm.
you know
Paul Shihad looks so
mhm,
small in
yeah.
comparison to the scale of what God Emperor plans. You know.
Yeah, exactly, right? So like they
Yeah.
both essentially serve the same purpose.
Yeah.
Even the Bene Gesserit breeding program was supposed to serve the same purpose, but for the 1%, right?
Yeah.
And this whole idea of like requiring revolution and war and chaos, um,
Mm-hmm.
in those separate kind of segments, in order for humankind to refresh itself and its genes, which was one of the, I think when I first read it as a kid, was something that I didn't quite understand until
Mm.
much later on, like just how fucked up that idea actually is. Like in
Yep.
order for us to exist as a species throughout a galaxy,
Mm.
you require violence, right, of some kind,
Mm.
and you require discontent. Like peace ultimately will kill off the human race. Like I didn't really understand the first few times that I read through it itself, and
Mm.
like I think like it's these few themes that come out in God Emperor that are just like, again, right, of like significant consequence,
Mm-hmm.
for the universe as a whole, and whole in a very, very different way from anything that we had got before that. Um,
Yes.
Heretics is okay by my book. Chapter House is again like as a kind of middle book, right? It feels very transitionary. We have no idea what Dune 7 is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
From what I understand, it was originally supposed to be two books. That got merged into one manuscript that
Mm-hmm.
was largely complete before Frank Herbert died, and Brian
Yeah.
is intending to put that out soon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I mean, we will get into Brian stuff shortly after this.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I totally agree with you about Idaho though.
Yeah. Idaho was almost of a non-factor in early books,
Yep,
but he became such a big part of the later books. In fact, like the Duncan Idaho character, if you include all his golas,
yep,
play a much bigger role in the larger scheme of Dune than any Atreides.
yep, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it just yeah, especially I think in God Emperor and later on in Chapter House, like that he is like pivotal in those
Mm-hmm.
particular areas for that, and it's so interesting, like just how if we were to accept the fact that he is essentially the same character across
Mm-hmm.
all these like different variations of him, right? His
Yeah.
character growth we get to see over 6 books, quite literally.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating to have like the Duncan Idaho that like trapezes into the keep like drunk and shouting and being rowdy, and what like the Duncan Idaho that we get in Chapter House, right? Who is
Mm-hmm.
like standing in the corner and deliberating and chimes in only when it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
It's a vastly different like take on that, and sometimes I'm a bit torn
Yep.
between the idea that you want something consistent across everything, right? Something that lasts throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhat of a archivist, that is separate from any of the other organizations necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that he isn't quite, like he exists in name, but is he really, you
No,
know?
he's not. He has different experiences.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. He has the memories of Duncan Idaho and all the Duncan Idaho golas prior to him. But people change
yeah.
over your lifetime, as you grow into young adulthood and adulthood. Duncan Idaho has gone through like several million adulthoods at this point, so his
Hmm.
personality radically changes over the many books because they take such drastic time jumps. 500 years, 1,000 years, 3,500 years. So to expect Duncan Idaho to be still the same rowdy person, great fighter, noble,
Yeah.
loyal that he was in the first book, and not expect him to be a bit more cynical
Hmm.
after everything that he has gone through. I think that was one of the great strengths of Frank Herbert's depiction of the growth of Duncan Idaho
Yeah.
towards the end.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I like it's a lot of people were kind of bothered by on the flip side were bothered by the lack of technological innovation over like 5,000 years
Yeah.
in the books, but again, but the lack of AI and the Butlerian jihad sort of stymied that,
Yeah.
the Telelexu aside,
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, that was cool. And I really want to see like just a book about the Telelexu. They are very fascinating to me. Like, what are your like the little corners of the Dune universe that's not part of the main story that's your favorite?
I've always been very fascinated with being able to explore like the Ixian technology, the conclave, right?
Yeah.
The Ixian conclave, like we get bits and pieces of that every once in a while. Whenever Frank needed, like, say, okay, there is technology. It does exist in a form that is convenient to the plot of my story at this point in time, and it is
Yeah.
Ixian, right?
Yeah.
So basically, like the only kind of like surviving and antiques of the Butlerian Jihad, yeah, in the Eastern
Mhm.
technology. Like we do, I mean, Brian does explore, what is that? What is the book called? The Machine Crusade, right? Which talks about the Butlerian Jihad.
Mhm.
But we never really get Ixian culture and technology. Like, what's up with that? You know, the they like so gives us hints of that, but
Mm.
they are much like the Bene Gesserit, like are geared towards a certain purpose. Whether it's the Ixians felt like technologies for technology's sake, and
Mm.
in a sci-fi world that is bread and butter. But because it is
Mm.
absent from the world of Dune or the universe of Dune, right? That makes it far more fascinating to me. That
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's one for sure. Yeah, the Bene Telexu is fascinating. I don't think we get very much of that outside of the Gola and what's the face dancer ship.
The face dances. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
the face dancers. That's pretty much all we get from that. And some of the mental assassins, of course. That would be fascinating. Like I've always thought of it as the male counterpart to the Bene Gesserit. And
Hmm.
in some readings, I understand what it would be. So it's fascinating just to see their differing um strategies, right, for going about like bring about the Kishwa's Haderach,
Hmm.
as well, and how the male counterpart to that, like, is a lot about violence and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I mean, like overall, the theme of this whole, we've always approached, or at least fiction has always thought of the idea that humanity has this warlike instinct, this
yep,
this conflict instinct, as a self-destructive mechanism within us that we needed to weed out. And Herbert almost argues the opposite, that it's not a self-destructive instinct but a survival instinct. It is a consistent renewal of, and upgrading of human beings, to make us more different, to make us better.
yep,
So survival through hardship is what defines us, not through peace. Peace makes you complacent. Peace makes you weak. And that's interesting. In one respect, Isaac Asimov and Frank Herbert agreed upon that.
hmm
They have kind of that same theme in both Foundation and in Dune, and that was cool. I almost wish, the fabled Dune 7 came out so I can read it, but Brian Herbert is doing his own version of that, along with his writing partner, what's his name,
Kevin J. Anderson.
Kevin J. Anderson. That's right. So I suppose this will be a good bridging off point into the Dune continuations. You've read more of the Brian Herbert and Kevin Anderson continuations than I have. What are your
Yep.
thoughts on them? And um ca- are they appropriate? Like would Dune, like hardcores,
Um,
like them? Are they worthy continuations or successes to the Dune franchise?
I Okay. So I have read. Let me just pull this up.
Yeah.
Right. So I've read the three preludes to Dune. So the house base books, right? House Atreides, House Harkonnen, House Corino.
Yeah.
I did read Butlerian Jihad and Machine Crusade. I don't think I read the Schools of Dune. Because
Okay.
I did feel like the encyclopedia covered most of that
Mm-hmm.
already. Brian is heavily, I mean, like as a legacy author, which is essentially what Brian is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Brian knows the world of Dune better than anybody, with the exception of Frank himself.
Oh yeah, I don't dispute that at all.
And
He
his
clearly knows it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
his attention to detail and just the wealth of information that he is privy to, and his understanding of like kind of the inner workings of his father's mind,
Yep.
allows him to flesh out parts that Frank never got the chance to.
Mm.
My issue isn't so much as a Dune fan as it is with me being a Frank Herbert fan.
Okay.
Because the prose is lacking.
Oh yeah, biggest
Yeah.
issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
like a lot of it would read better as like, how like Star Wars, we get a lot of like these picture books, and then they show you like the data, and all like the blueprints, and all of that.
Mm.
It
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes feels like some of these things would read better as archival instead of
Mm-hmm.
novels, right? Like, give
Yes.
me the
Yeah.
information to feed into the story that I've already grown to love, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to come up with like stories of your own that fit, sure, have the
Sure.
detail, give me the information, but the prose isn't necessarily, I mean, it's not Frank Herbert standard, lah, which is pretty difficult to achieve, you
Of
know.
course.
So I do think that they are functional in that particular manner. I do think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people will find some value from being able to dig into something that they already love.
Mm.
But you don't have, like, say for example, in the Preludes to Dune, right? Like, you never have any of the characters stand out to you like any of the Atreides or the Harkonnens, or the Emperor, the Imperial family stand out in the mainline stories, right? Like, none of them are written to be that. And of course, in retrospect, it's always easy to kind of say, right? Like, they aren't the main story. These characters aren't of much consequence, right?
Yep.
And especially because you know that it's Brian writing it, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so it's a bit hard. Whether or not Dune 7, how it's gonna turn out, because, like, from what I understand, like, a large swath of the manuscript is already done.
Mm-hmm.
And how he chooses to kind of put that out. I think it'd be interesting. Yeah, but, like, Brian has put out a ton of work. He's put out almost twice the number of books his father has.
Mm-hmm.
And they are of significant length,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest. So my advice is, if you're listening to this and you're wondering whether or not to kind of dive into what's called the expanded Dune universe,
Mm-hmm.
pick the parts that are most interesting to you, right? Like, if the schools, your Bene Gesserit, your Mentats, your Guild Navigators interest you, then go into that. If you want to know a bit more about the Atreides, go read House Atreides, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessary for you to, like, consume the entirety of everything that's been written.
Mm-hmm.
There's much smaller ones like Hunters of Dune, Sandworms of Dune, Paul of Dune. They're okay.
Yep.
But they don't carry the kind of weight and the kind of significance, I think, um he maybe intends, but they are all very heartfelt tributes to a legacy of a very brilliant father.
Oh yes, absolutely. Brian knows the world very well, and his work. I think the whether this is whether this is a compliment or whether this is an insult, I don't know. But it comes across as very entertaining fan fiction. Because it just doesn't have the literary depth and nuance that Frank Herbert infused into his new novels. Him or his writing partner Kevin Anderson is just not at that level.
Yep.
Which I suppose is not an insult to them. Lah. I mean, clearly, who is at that level, right? But it's not as I tend to not like continuations of legacy titles by different creators, with some very rare exceptions. For example, Brian Sanderson's Wheel of Time continuations are almost better than the originals.
Yeah.
But that's a testament to how good Sanderson is, and you got like the Damon Lindelof like Watchmen sequel, which is unauthorized but also very good. But on the flip side, you have like J.J. Abrams doing Star Wars,
Yeah.
and this seems more. Actually, no, like, it's not that bad. Like, this is not J.J. Abrams doing Star Wars. Like, that is probably bottom of the barrel. Like, he
Yeah.
still respects Frank Herbert's work. But man, there's just something missing for me. It just doesn't feel like literature to me. It feels like reading on a fan fiction forum, and that's not to
Hmm.
diss fan fiction writers because a lot of them are very good. This to me doesn't even rise above like top fan fiction writers. It's just okay and it's very informative. The
Yeah.
word is, but it's not literature and it's not like good reading material. And it's just my issue with it, lah. So, if you do want to see the world of Dune continue, hey, feel free to write Brian Herbert. To read Brian Herbert's books because I know he has a lot of fans,
Yep. Yep.
and I know he has managed to win over a large portion of the Dune fandom. So hey, good to him lah. Of course, the
Yep.
other half is like spending all their free time on Reddit, just like trashing him. So you will fall in one of the other camps lah.
Yeah.
So give it a shot. Give it a
Yeah.
shot.
Before
Yeah.
we move on from the books, I just want to make a correction. So Dune 7
Hmm.
is actually Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune. It's
Mm.
already out.
Yeah, split into two, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's split into two. Yeah, so that is, if you want, like, the conclusion to the mainline story, but as written by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson,
Hmm.
based upon the outline that Frank Herbert left
Hmm.
for posterity's sake, I guess. It is out. I haven't read them. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if I will. But yeah, yeah. So that's basically book 8, Hunters of Dune and Sandmons of Dune.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, like, I also didn't want to offend like Robert Jordan fans also.
Oh
I
yeah.
I spent like the last few months reading 18, right? 18, 19, about a lot lah, a lot Wheel of Time novels to get
Uh-huh.
ready for the show.
Mhm.
I gotta say, like, the middle portions of the Wheel of Time novels are just like garbage. They're so not good. They're so bad. I only got back into it when when Sanderson took over.
Yep.
And then suddenly the book became great again, and I didn't have to read like 300 pages of describing like how someone's fingers look like a sausage. It's yeah, never mind. I gotten sidetracked. Let's move on to let's move on to the adaptations of Dune.
Yep.
By beginning with the classic 1984 David Lynch adaptation of Dune, infamously trashed by critics and fans of Dune, but has seemed to find a new life as a cult classic, and people, more modern fans, have sort of redeemed it in their eyes. Primarily, I think because the space camp has become endearing.
Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
the aspects that you didn't like in 1984, suddenly in like 2021 you're like, hey, it's kind of cheesy and kind of cool.
Uh-huh.
Like, it's there's an endearingness to it lah, and to the effort made, certainly not David Lynch's best work. Certainly David Lynch doesn't even like this movie.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is down to studio interference, as is always the case.
Mhm.
You are a bigger Dune fan than I am. What was your thoughts upon watching the David Lynch Dune? Is it unfairly maligned, or is it a hidden piece of genius?
There is okay, the first time I watched it was maybe like, oh man, early 20s probably.
Mm-hmm.
And like I watched it reluctantly after doing one of my like rereads of the series.
Mm.
Um there are moments where like it really really kind of clicks, right? Like the image in your head and just like just general visual direction, it really does click, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some castings that I just think are like brilliant, like Max von Sydow as Keynes is
Yeah.
one of those instances. I'm just like, damn, like that. I'm not so much sure of Sting as Fade,
Mm-hmm.
rather, but whatever. Patrick Stewart again as Gurney Halleck, like Hollywood's idea of ugly, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I mean, like there are moments in time, there are like I think some of the very iconic kind of screenshots that if people were to Google kind of Dune, um, or kind of see with like the Fremen kind of standing on the sand dune itself, and a lot of like the wide shots. A lot of it is very very beautiful. But in terms of like faithfulness to the novel, in terms of like the general kind of like screenwriting, it's extremely messy and in no
Mm.
way fits. Like it is neither a tribute to Dune or an offshoot of Dune or an adaptation of Dune.
Mm-hmm.
It is good, or rather it has become popular because it's a Lynch thing,
Yeah.
in my opinion. Yeah, that's basically where I sit on that.
Yeah, Lynch, of course, gained worldwide fame for masterful movies
Oh
like
yeah.
Blue Velvet, or masterful TV shows like Twin Peaks.
Hmm.
So his fame has gotten from there, lah, and his fandom has gone back to watch Dune with kind of rose-tinted glasses, lah.
Yeah.
Dune 1984. I mean, I'm sorry, I know a lot of like older fans of Dune. People in their 50s or 60s have a more a kinder outlook on this, and are willing to overlook the failures, lah. But to me, this is just a mess of a movie. It's almost incomprehensible. It's
Yeah.
unstructured. There are some good moments in it, but it's just not enough to make up for uh, the almost bastardization of the source material. I think halfway through the movie, Lynch wanted to quit also because of the studio interference. So
Yep.
his heart wasn't in it. This was just not the Dune adaptation that we deserved or we should have gotten. On the flip side, there's some things I enjoyed. Brian Eno's score, I think, still like holds up to today. Brian Eno is a genius, and
Hmm.
it works.
Yeah.
David Lynch's eye for striking imagery like still works. It's just like the story just wasn't there. It didn't encapsulate the story. So moving on from this adaptation of Dune, which at least on the bare minimum, tried to capture the spirit of Dune and the story of Dune.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Jodorowsky's attempt to adapt Dune. In fact, his attempt even predates David Lynch's Dune.
Yeah.
Um, in what is one of the most bizarre, bonkers, batshit bananas, ambitious, audacious adaptations of Dune that I've ever heard. Has been detailed in a wonderful documentary called Jodorowsky's Dune.
Hmm.
It's certainly one of the best documentaries I've
Oh
seen in recent
yeah.
years. Also,
Yeah.
just the work of the documentary itself is great.
Hmm.
But we're not here to talk about the documentary. We're here to talk about the ideas that Jodorowsky wanted to bring to Dune.
Yeah.
um he said quite famously at the end of the documentary, right? He said like, I wanted to. He pounced his fist into his palm, right? I want to rape the book. I want
Yeah.
to rape the book, you know. And I sort of like uh cackle at the creative license that he wants to take with it.
Yeah.
And some of the ideas are like so ridiculous and so out there that I kind of want to see it anyway,
Yeah.
because if you're not going to be faithful, then just don't be faithful at all. Like, go your own way with it
Sure.
entirely.
Yeah.
Your own architecture, your own design, your own take on the material. If you want to have that kind of creative license, you might as well go all the way, right? And I was like, yeah, it could have been a very surreal and legendary vision, and
Yeah.
a lot of its aesthetic has been stolen by Alien, by Star Wars. A lot of the designs created right for here were kind of mimicked later on.
Yeah.
Like, its carcass was picked by later sci-fi greats to
Uh-huh.
make their own sci-fi great. So, but as a Dune fan and a reader of the books, this must have like both. It must have like astounded you, like, in good and bad ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Jodorowsky Dune kind of like, I mean, discovering what that was and all of that. Then it's kind of like first time kind of stepping out of the books itself.
Mm-hmm.
Slowly kind of like discovered the attempt for that shortly after I watched Lynch's version. And of course in 2013, when did the 2013 was when the documentary came out. It was fascinating, right, to me to
Mm-hmm.
see how far someone could possibly take a much beloved story because he could, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something that definitely played. Like for me, for one thing, right, the casting was insane.
Mm-hmm.
Just like just to name a couple of things, right? For the score, he was thinking about Pink Floyd,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Perfect. Yeah.
For the visual effects and for practical effects, it was Geiger and
Yep.
John Giroud.
Yep.
For character design, Salvador Dali as the Emperor, Orson Welles
Mm-hmm.
as Baron Harkonnen, Mick Jagger as Fade Rata,
Yep.
David Carradine as Leto Atreides. Like that is an all-star cast as far as all-star cast goes for for that time. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we've gotten an all-star cast in this 2021 version, no doubt about that. But like some of the castings for what Jodorowsky wanted is kind of like, pretty much the best you could get at the time. And to be very honest, it would probably have been spot on, especially Orson Welles' Baron Harkonnen, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What's your take on his material? Like, would have been. I mean, it's clearly a bastardization. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with the
Yeah.
book, lah. But would it have been an interesting thing to watch?
It would have been psychedelic for sure. Right? Like I've never imagined Dune to be colorful in any like kind of shape or form, right? Really, like Herbert doesn't really go into much of that except with, family banners and stuff like that. Like the most colorful I've ever seen Dune be is the computer games, right? Like Dune 2000 and all of that. I'm not sure if some of you have played that, which was
Yep.
just kind of like a small game that came out at the height of like, the RTS craze back in the 90s
Mm-hmm.
or the early 2000s rather. But yeah, like it is so strange. But a lot of the time, some of the sketches that he had for some of the tech,
Yep.
for the carry-alls, I think, in particular for the topters and the harvesting machines, like those seemed feasible.
Mm-hmm.
If for nothing else, but because Herbert doesn't really go into much detail about what those possibly could be. Yeah,
Yes.
so like
Yeah.
those, I was like, okay, yeah, maybe. But everything else, right? It's like watching the documentary was this mix of intrigue and horror for a
Mm.
big Dune fan. It's just like,
Yes.
no. and then you're like, really? And then you're like,
Mm.
thank God this didn't happen. But at the same time, you're just kind of like, I don't know, right? Like, it could have been something, like vastly, vastly different, but still something of substance. Um, of course, Jodorowsky himself, like, in his own right, a legendary director. So
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to kind of like postulate on what my feelings could possibly be about something that didn't get made. But still, like, entirely enjoyed the documentary
Hmm.
because it was just a roller coaster of emotions. As someone who's familiar with the origin text.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Alexandro Jodorowsky is a bit of a mad genius. He's this like Chilean avant-garde veteran of midnight movies, or
Yeah,
B grade midnight movies.
yeah.
If you want to kind of get a sense of his work that is not this Dune documentary, I'll advise you to go watch El Topo
Hmm.
from 1970 and The Holy Mountain in 1973. In many, many, many ways, Jodorowsky is akin to David Lynch.
Yeah,
They are almost like cut from the same cloth,
yeah,
and it's weird that like they kept picking this kinds of directors to visualize Dune, because Dune has always been known as this unfilmable book, right?
yes,
Until a bunch of people tried lah,
yeah,
and I suppose it makes sense that you go for the more psychedelic surreal type of directors to try to make that happen lah. And I think
yeah.
like the new is perhaps the ideal middle ground for a very functional blockbuster director,
Uh-huh.
and also a very artistically ambitious director. He's like right in the middle there, in the sweet
Yeah,
spot. So
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, like, there was the second attempt where they wanted Ridley Scott, right?
Hmm.
To do that. I think it was De Laurentiis that was trying to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, like, we got Villeneuve. Like, I'm happy
Hmm.
with that, for sure. And I'm happy for that to stay in his hands for as much as the studio will allow him to, or as much as the fans will support that vision through. It's just, yeah, it just fits. I don't know what it is about, like, this idea that Dune should be in the hands of, like, Lynch esque or Jodorowsky esque. It's
Yeah.
maybe it's the idea of the spice, that the drug is hallucinogenic.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I mean, like, so that's such a small part of the book, really.
Hmm.
In so many ways.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Denis Villeneuve is like in the mode of like modern middle brow filmmakers.
Yeah.
Shall we say like in a Nolan? Like if Nolan could tell a coherent story, he would be like Denis Villeneuve. Like no disrespect to Nolan, I actually like, despite my making fun of him for the last year because of Tenet, right?
Yeah.
Like I actually really enjoy the vast majority of his work.
Oh yeah, for
Uh,
sure. He's still one of my favorite directors. It's just like we don't know where the fuck Tenet is going, and we've talked about that on, like, multiple episodes.
I
Um.
think I think my problem was like I knew where Tenet was going. It's like it didn't need to be that abstruse, like
Oh.
for what was essentially his James Bond movie.
Okay. Okay.
Uh, yeah. And okay, so we move on from two adaptations that were not very faithful. One
Oh.
at least tried to be, and the other did not try at all.
Yeah.
To Sci-Fi's pair of Dune miniseries, covering all six books. Um, in the early like 2000s, Sci-Fi, now it's spelled as SYFY, but it
Yeah.
used to be it used to be spelled properly, Sci-Fi Channel. It kind of went through a minor renaissance in the late 90s and early aughts. It produced sci-fi television that set the bar for a lot of fascinating entertainment to
Yeah.
come. It had a lot of great like shows like Stargates, and stuff like that. It sets the standard lah for modern sci-fi television. It's the era where they developed the Dune miniseries, which the first of which came in 2000. And it was a massive production for television at that time,
Uh-huh.
especially for a basic cable channel. It had an estimated 20 million budget for the three film length episodes that encompass each book within the Dune novel for the first miniseries, and then the second one capped it off with the next novels. It featured an international cast. It won Emmys for effects and cinematography. It was this massive undertaking for the channel, and I think to this day it remains, along with its sequel, Children of Dune, I think the highest rated program that Sci-Fi has ever produced.
Yep.
And the Dune series is an excellent example, a case study for how do you delineate the line between how close an adaptation of a book should run
Uh huh.
in order to make a good viewing experience. This is the question that always needs considering when literature turns into cinema, or in this case, the small screen, and the balance is rarely achieved. And I think the sci-fi miniseries, just in terms of its ability to take a bit of creative license and stay faithful to the themes and the story in general,
Yep.
uh, it achieves a balance that I think even surpasses Denis Villeneuve's film. We haven't talked about it, but
Yep.
we will in
Yep.
the next episode.
Yep.
Just in terms of like its story element and what it tried to bring to the screen from a writing
Uh
standpoint,
huh.
I actually think that this is the best Dune adaptation that has ever been.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And I mean, what are your thoughts on the miniseries?
Um. Very, very honestly, before we wanted to revisit this year, right? The only thing I remember from the series,
Mm.
and I've said this before to you multiple times, but for the shit of it, is Alia training? Well, in the book she's naked, but like Alia training like barely clothed, with the like the training dummies at like hyper speed, right?
It's from Messiah, right? That scene.
Yeah, the scenes from Messiah, like that scene, man, that is stuck in my mind. What's the actress's name? Daniela Amavia.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, seriously, like that is the one of the main scenes that is stuck in my mind, like since I watched it. Um, I think it's very easy, especially for people who are going into to see, Danny's version of it, that Dune would necessarily, in this day and age, lend itself very easily to a TV series. And I think
Yeah.
Children of Dune, despite the fact that that was like ages ago, right? Like,
Mm.
what was it? It's almost 2 decades ago.
Yeah, just about.
2003,
Yeah.
yeah. So 2 decades ago, like sci-fi proved it, right? Like this is what the content of Dune could possibly be. And I totally agree with you, just in terms of like how faithful it was to the story beats. A lot of the dialogue was kind of like word for word as well, which is a feat in and of itself, right? In an adaptation of something onto the screen.
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, I don't, there are things that I remember the sets being amazing. I remember the costumes being on point for what I
Mm-hmm.
imagined Dune to be at that point in time of my life.
Yep.
um but yeah, like it really, like revisiting I didn't watch all of it again, but like revisiting some episodes that I could find here and there,
Mm-hmm.
it really does add to the case that yeah, maybe what we really need isn't like a bunch of movies, but just like a long ass running series,
Mm.
right? And I think we'll discuss some of that in our main review of Dune 2021. Um, in our next genre equality, and maybe like do some comparisons there, and just talk about like the medium of the movie
Mm.
for this particular franchise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dune as a TV series will probably work best, especially with the scale of the epic.
Yeah.
I've already praised its faithfulness as a strength of the Dune miniseries, both miniseries, the original one in 2000, which covered the first book,
Yep.
and the later books in 2003. Uh, Strangely enough, it is also the weakness of the miniseries.
Hmm.
The story drags a lot when you just vomit out whatever's on the book
Oh
in
yeah.
prose and
Hmm.
onto the screen.
Yeah.
There are places where it feels like the narrative gets over explained because it's like someone reading a book to you, like literally. That's not what I want to watch
Hmm.
in a visual adaptation, right?
Yep.
It's a noble instinct, but it can get tedious in places. There are, like you said, the lines lifted carefully from a checklist of what must be done in a Dune movie. We got this bit, and now we do this bit, and now we do this bit, without any sort of thought of how it would flow in a visual medium.
Hmm. Yep.
And that is where Denis Villeneuve obviously is leagues ahead of the miniseries.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, I like the cast. I think of all the Duke Letos that I've heard, like William Hurt is not the ideal in my mind choice, but he plays it really well.
Yeah.
He brings a certain reserve calm that works for the character. It's real good. I think Ian McNeice, who plays uh who plays Baron Harkonnen is very good as well.
Yeah.
The guy who plays Paul Atreides, man, I forgot his name. He's been in a lot of sci-fi projects actually.
Alec Newman.
Alec Newman, that's right.
Yeah.
He is like way too old. As is Cal McLaughlin, to be honest. Like
Yeah.
they're all way too old to be Paul Atreides. But whatever,
Yeah.
that's where they chose to go with it. Okay. I think one of the places where the original miniseries succeeded or even improved upon the books and deviates is, I think, the smartest change it made is to make, I think, Irulan an active participant in the narrative.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Making her way through the machinations of the other houses to learn the truth about what's going on between her father, House Harkonnen, and House Atreides. Like, because
Hmm.
it doesn't make her a passive bystander. It uses her as a plot device, but it also gives her something to do, which is something Iridan doesn't have anything to do in any of the books. She's there, and she's just this poor, like, um trophy wife that Paul has, that he doesn't even have sex with. You kind of feel bad for her, but she doesn't really do anything. And then the miniseries makes her important. It makes her a spy and makes her an active participant. I
Yeah.
think that was a really really cool change, and that's something I think that Dinty might want to look at also if he makes a second movie,
Yeah. I
or
think
the
that
or the third movie.
I think that
Yeah.
there's definite opportunity there to flesh it out, right? A lot of the time, like the reason why within the books itself, like Irulan is dismissed, is because many of the time when she is around, right, she's seen through the eyes of the other women who are more powerful than her.
Yes.
Jessica in particular, Chani sometimes, Alia,
Hmm.
right? Like we are looking at the Atreides women essentially who are leagues ahead of her in terms of like their powers, their political standing, their witching ways, like all of them are way ahead of her, and she is not taken seriously because of that. But if the way that the books are written is anything, right? Irulan is the most influential person in Paul's life to exist throughout the ages because she's read in every subsequent era to come, right? Like her attention to detail in all of her archivist stuff, right?
Hmm.
So many of the beginning sort of excerpts are written by her, right? Like there are tons and tons of books that she's written about Paul, about his story, and all of that. She's heard through the ages.
Hmm.
The rest of them are remembered as names through her, So for them to take that kind of leap is something, yeah, I would be all for. Especially, um, well, I guess we'll do our fantasy casting for the genre episode instead. Yeah,
Hmm.
if we get our fantasy casting for who we think might be a great Irulan, like it would be a waste not to use her in that way. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. I 100% agree. Like, Ireland is how Paul's story is known to the universe, right?
Yep.
She is his biographer, so to speak. She tells his story, to quote Hamilton's Eliza, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that is enough to make her an important part of the mythology, and to make her more important part of the narrative. And I hope, like, the screen adaptation kind of not does her justice, because if you do her justice, the character, then she would have any part to play, like
Yep.
improve upon it.
Yep. For sure.
One of the adaptations that I love the most, that deviated a lot from the book but added and improved upon it by making characters more active and less passive, was the American Gods season 1 adaptation.
Yeah.
And I think, like, you could kind of go that route with making underutilized characters more important in the adaptations.
Yeah. I think it would be
Yeah.
I think it would be fairly fascinating, right? Because like Danny has already said that, part two is going to be told through Chinese eyes.
Mm.
So I mean we could very easily, if it's whether or not it's part, I don't think it'll be part three lah, but whether or not Messiah gets made, it'll
Hmm.
be easy to kind of shift, right? It'll be fascinating actually for it to shift to Ireland.
Mm.
Again. But we'll see. Like that's pretty far into the future. Part two is still up in the air. So
Yeah.
um yeah. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, like, there's an opportunity there that I think is, you know, it'll be great, right? Much like, there's an opportunity for Alia to be a fascinating character.
Hmm.
If this movie franchise continues strength to strength.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's doing well in the international box office. I hope it does well domestically in the US, because that's where WB is going to be looking lah. If it does well domestically, then they will certainly invest in more Dune lah.
Yeah.
And I mean, to be honest, like WB has like gold on their hands here. This could be Denis Villeneuve's uh first big success
Yep.
box in terms of box office, and not critically and not artistically. He's always been a success there,
Yeah.
but his first big box office success could deliver, and this could be really a new Game of Thrones. If WB plays their cards right lah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't mean Game of Thrones in terms of like quality. I mean like in terms of popularity. Like this could easily like get big. It has that vibe. I think Game of Thrones has really trained people, the casual audience, to be more patient with the house intrigue and all of that. With larger ideas and themes. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think you could easily tap into that market. And I know like every studio and every streaming service is trying to tap into the market. Like
Yeah.
Netflix has been like, how many fantasy series have they've been releasing like month after month? Like The Witcher started it, and then a bunch of others, Dark Crystal and all of that. They're trying to tap into that market. Apple TV is doing it with Foundation.
Yep.
Amazon is doing it with Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
God, how much money do they have? A lot lah. Jeff Bezos has all the money in the world.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I
yeah,
mean, like,
yeah.
it will be. I don't know, right? Who's doing the Ben and Gesserit series?
I don't know.
Is it
I don't know.
HBO or is it being shopped
H-
around?
HBO Max,
Eh,
because WB owns HBO.
right. Yeah. So, like, if they're gonna do it, I mean, like, honestly, if you wanna do TV series Dune level stuff, like, you gotta have like Game of Thrones money, right? Or like Expanse money,
Hmm.
just to be able to kind of pull that off. So we'll see. Like, I would love to see like as many things come out of Dune as possible. And if Villeneuve is the first one to kind of kick it off and get it into motion, then I'm more than happy for it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, man. And that has been this episode of the Behold podcast. We went through the length and breadth of Dune, from the books to the adaptations to the TV adaptations as well.
Yep.
And we kind of touched upon Brian Herbert's continuations as well. We had mixed feelings on those. But I urge you to check out the Dune source material.
Yep.
If you like if you like the movie, and even if you don't like the movie, perhaps the Dune book will interest you too, because
Yep.
it's a little bit different than the movie too. Speaking of the movie, we'll talk about it in our upcoming genre equality, which we'll be recording next week. So in a little bit over a week from now, you'll get to hear our review and thoughts about Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Dune. Is it the Dune adaptation that we've always wanted and deserved? Some people say yes, some people say no, but you'll find out our opinions then.
Yeah. 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 We won't
Yeah.
we won't touch you anymore on this. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. You can find us on all the podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple, Stitcher. We are also available on our primary home, which is Mixcloud, which has been our home since the beginning.
Yep.
We are available on YouTube as well, if that's your preference.
Hmm.
Yeah, and we'll be back in about a week's time for genre equality. Anything else about Dune that you want to say before we cap off?
No, no. I hope if you guys if Dune is in cinemas for you guys, please go out to cinemas, but stay safe, of course. To
Hmm.
go and watch that. And yeah, you can connect with us on our socials and stuff like that if you want to talk about it or discuss that. Yeah, but again, thank you so much for listening. Like and
Definitely.
subscribe, guys, on any of the platforms. Or you following us on Spotify, or like us on subscribe on YouTube. That really helps us out.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk to you soon.
Yes, yes, and I'm glad I didn't bring up this guy called Holtzman from the Dune Encyclopedia.
Oh
I'm a little obsessed with him. So
God.
like, if you want to find out about him, right?
Yeah.
Like, just Google Holtzman Dune universe.
Oh my God.
His fictional backstory is like the most incredible thing. I could have spent like another hour and a half just talking about Holtzman, because I have this whole pitch for a Holtzman show.
Yeah.
But if you want to talk to me about that, talk to me about it in real life. Like, it's a bit too much. I have too much to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Till then, this has been Zero.
This is Isa.
Goodbye, guys.